So on to the good part now. Today, I'm delighted to introduce our last speaker in this series, one of my favorite Humanities Center directors, Professor Jennifer Ho, who will speak about combating racism through a public humanities perspective. Professor Jennifer Ho is the director of the Center for Humanities and Arts at the University of Colorado Boulder, where she is also a professor of ethnic studies, whose research and teaching are centered in Asian American literary and cultural studies, intersectionality, critical race studies, anti-racist theory and practice, and critical mixed race studies, among many other things. She is the president of the Association for Asian American Studies and the author of 3 scholarly books, Racial Ambiguity in Asian American Culture, published by Rutgers in 2015, which won the 2016 South Atlantic Modern Languages Association Award for Best Monograph, as well as Understanding Gish-Jen, published by University of South Carolina Press, also in 2015, and Consumption and Identity in Asian American Culture, published in 2005. She's also the editor of 2 edited collections. In addition to her academic work, Professor Jennifer Ho is active in community engagement around issues of race and intersectionality, leading workshops on anti-racism and how to talk about race in our current social climate. You can follow her on Twitter at Dr. Jen Ho. I think that's it, right? That's the handle. Professor Jennifer Ho, welcome to VCU. I'm so delighted you could be here.
Thank you so much, Christina, for that very warm introduction. And I have some beginning thanks as well. So thank you, Christina, for the invitation. Thank you, Ronnie, for the lovely advertising and the support behind the scenes. And just thank you to all of you who've shown up on, I'm sure, what is a lovely evening where you could be outdoors since you're in Virginia. I was actually, Christina and I talked about the possibility of me coming out because I spent 17 years prior to coming to Colorado, living in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. And I have not had a decent biscuit since August 2019 when I moved here. But there will be, there will be time to travel in the future when it's safer and more reliable. And I will say this, you could probably hear that I actually am either dealing with a cold or a mild case of COVID. I'm actually waiting PCR test results, but I'm delighted to be here with all of you. And one of the things I like to do when I begin a talk, especially that is dealing with race and racism, is to acknowledge the land that I am on. And I mean, not just that I am coming to you from Boulder County, Colorado, but I'm coming to you from the traditional territories of the Cheyenne, Arapaho, and Ute nations. And I share that not out of a sense of performativity, but to say that if we are going to be talking about issues of race and racism, then I think it's just something that we should do to acknowledge the power structures of the places that we are at. And in the United States, the power structures are one in which settler colonialism is why the United States was founded on indigenous land. The other more sobering statistic that I like to share, or not like to share, but believe it's important to share during COVID-19 is the death toll in the US and globally. So as of today, 989,000 people have died from COVID-19. That figure is 6.21 million globally. I share this in part to remind us that we are still living in the midst of a global pandemic, and to also acknowledge that some of you may be dealing with real loss and grief. We're all dealing with the grief of what it means to be living in the midst of a global pandemic. And I think when we're talking about hard issues like race and racism, it's important for us to acknowledge the places in our lives that may be really tender. So I wanted to really say to all of you to please take care of yourselves as I go through this talk. Not that I think there's going to be anything triggering, but the name of the talk is about combating racism. And that in and of itself can be a very challenging and triggering subject to talk about. So without further ado, I'm going to share my slides and get into the meat of the talk. And I really welcome, and I mean this genuinely, any and all types of questions. I feel like I am here to answer any question that anyone has And I know that talking about race and racism is very sensitive and people feel embarrassed to ask questions. But I think you can put an anonymous question in the Q&A, and that's really fine. There's genuinely no question that is off limits for me to answer. So let me share my screen. And here we go. Okay. And so I should also share that I use she, her pronouns in case anyone is interested. And as Christina mentioned, you can follow me on Twitter at Dr. Jen Ho. So this is the roadmap for this talk. I'm going to first discuss what the story of America is. And you'll notice that I put that in quotes. I will talk about white supremacy, critical race theory, as well as the role of the humanities and humanities centers in talking about the story of America. I'm then going to pivot to talking about my particular story as a public humanities scholar. Kind of, you can think of this as a public intellectual genealogy, if you will, as one way to also disrupt the more standard stories of America and Americans that I think have been promulgated in most of our K through 12 and some of our college lives, and certainly in kind of general popular and public discourse. And that's a story that definitely involves public libraries and public schools. And I think it's important to highlight that because public libraries and public schools across the nation are sadly under attack. I'm then going to talk about the leadership roles that I've embraced and end with talking about advocacy. You will notice that there's a picture of a very cute dog on this slide. So that's my dog Chaucer. He's a Pembroke Welsh Corgi. Studies have shown that in a talk, especially if one's going to use PowerPoint slides, it is helpful to embed pictures of cute animals that are peppered throughout the PowerPoint, not on every single slide, but on a few slides as a way to keep people engaged. And so you will see that Chaucer's face is going to appear from time to time. And you can think of it as a way to kind of keep you engaged for when you get to see his smiling corgi face. So the story of America. So for those of us who grew up in the United States and went through K through 12 education here, and this is a little tongue in cheek, and this is a little and very rough. And maybe some of you, especially if you're younger, may have had a very different K through 12 experience than I did. But I think this is probably a pretty common narrative that anyone who is 40 and over likely heard about what the story of America is, right? And so the story of America begins with Christopher Columbus. The story of America is about discovery, right? That it's a landmass that apparently was just sitting there, and then boom, Christopher Columbus comes around, and now it is a thing. And then after Christopher Columbus, and this is where, textbooks get a little bit fuzzy, you then have pilgrims coming from England. And they're escaping religious persecution, and they land on Plymouth Rock, and they befriend Native Americans, or in the parlance of my K through 12 life, Indians. And in fellowship and friendship, they have Thanksgiving, and this is why in November we eat turkey. Now, the story of America gets a little dark because we do talk about slavery. We talk about African people taken to the United States to work on plantations. But the good news is that Abraham Lincoln comes around and he frees the slaves, and the Civil War is fought to free the slaves. And then, the Union triumphs. The United States is saved as a single entity, and slavery is over. There is a recognition, however, that, even with the end of slavery, that there's still racism and that this is bad. It's bad to discriminate against Black people, Jim Crow laws, et cetera, et cetera. But Martin Luther King Jr. makes a speech on the Mall in Washington, and somehow racism is over. And what we end with is that the United States is the greatest country in the nation, right? And certainly at various sporting events, we are oftentimes hearing that the United States is number one. So that's a kind of very traditional story of America that I will say continues to be replicated in various forms in K through 12 curriculum, and then in popular and public discourse. Now, that story of America is very much one that is rooted in white supremacy. And I think those of you who are listening to me probably already guessed this, already knew the ways in which this notion of who's American and who discovers America, again, rooted in settler colonialism, which is very much rooted in the concept of white supremacy. So white supremacy, and when I do anti-racism workshops, I'm really very careful to discuss what white supremacy is and what it's not, because this is a term that ends up triggering a lot of people, particularly a lot of white people. So I want to be really clear. White supremacy is not about individual white people or even groups of white people. White supremacy is an ideology. So white supremacy, like any other ideology, like capitalism, is everywhere, and it's foundational to the United States. It just simply is. So for example, who we think of as American, who gets to be American versus who we understand to be hyphenated Americans. Like someone like me, who's an Asian American, cannot just simply say that I'm American. I continuously to this day get asked where I'm from. And when I say where I'm from, like where I'm physically located, such as right now, Colorado, or previously North Carolina, I will often be met with people saying, no, but where are you really from? Or where are you, or finally they get around to what's your heritage or where your ancestors from. They essentially want to know what my ethnicity is, because the answer that I'm American isn't sufficient, because somehow we don't envision people that look like me to be American. That again is the role of white supremacy. It underlines who we think of as belonging to the United States, who we envision to be the leaders of the United States, who we think of as the major figures in US history, as well as the actors and the artists in popular culture. So this brings us to critical race theory. Now, some of you may be hearing about this, that there are attacks on critical race theory, or there are people who are very concerned that critical race theory has infiltrated K-12 classrooms. By the way, I'd be happy to get into this more in the Q&A. But critical race theory is important for us to understand why there is this previous narrative of the story of America and what critical race theory can say about what the actual history of the United States is. So first of all, critical race theory developed out of critical legal studies in the 1980s. So it began through legal scholars, and it was mostly taught, particularly in the 80s and 90s, in law schools. In a nutshell, critical race theory investigates and analyzes ways that racial identities and systemic, and this is important, systemic racism have undergirded US policies and laws. And I'm saying the United States, but critical race theory can be applied to other nations and other contexts. It did develop, however, in the United States. And one of the things that it investigates is how does race and systemic racism influence society, culture, laws, policies, politics? How does it shape cultural and social norms? So as I mentioned before, it's usually a field of study that's taught at the graduate level in colleges and universities. Another way to think about critical race theory is that we can use it as a lens to apply to thinking about what US history and society is. So for example, what is the story of the United States? So first of all, I cross out America because it is a little presumptuous of us to think of the United States as somehow being commensurate with this huge landmass of North America and South America that also happens to include Latin America. And so I try very hard to use precise language in my scholarship, and more precisely when we're talking about the story of the United States, we then have to begin, as I did begin this talk, with an acknowledgement that we are on indigenous land. And so the story of the United States begins with European settlers who bought and stole indigenous land in North America in the process that we know of as settler colonialism. We also know that Europeans bought and stole people from Africa, designated them as Black, right? And so this is in the modern period. And by modern period, I mean like 15th century, modern era, enslaved them. And so again, in terms of more accurate language, I don't use the word slave to be commensurate with either Black people or enslaved Africans who were brought to the Americas. I talk about slavery as a process that in the period of time I'm talking about with respect to US history impacts largely Africans who are enslaved and brought to the United States. And they're brought to work in what we now know of the United States, in Latin America, in South America, in the Caribbean. The story of the United States is also about labor that is exploited. So Asian and Latin American immigrants coming to the United States, sometimes coming as indentured servants, right? So more of a forced choice. Sometimes they intend to return to their homelands, right? They just intend to come and make money in the US and then return back, and they're sending remittances back to their homelands. But various laws are created in reaction to Asian and Latin American labor. We see the traces of this now in our immigration and naturalization laws and policies, particularly on the southern border. So where does that get us in terms of the role of humanities as a field and humanities centers in particular? And I will say that as someone who directs a humanities center, I want to be really careful that I am not using my center to forward my own pet projects or my own intellectual interests, because I do want the Center for Humanities and the Arts at CU Boulder to be a space and a place that is welcoming of all types of scholarship, of all types of stories. And I don't want this to just be, my own vanity project. On the other hand, I think that it is natural for humanities center directors to shape the agendas of what their humanities centers take up and discuss. And I will say that I think in our current moment, particularly with the rise of anti-Asian racism that has evolved during COVID-19, that I've seen that I can play a role both as a director of a humanities center, as well as an Asian American studies, critical race studies scholar, who is comfortable being interviewed and writing opinion pieces for more public consumption. Because I think that this too is what we want humanities centers and the field of humanities to be able to do. That it is certainly fine for those of us who are scholars with PhDs and with expertise that we write articles and we write books and we produce scholarship that is for a very particular narrow audience. That's exactly fine. That's exactly what humanities centers should be supporting. I also think for those of us who have capacity to make our research more widely available and understood, given the present moment we're in. So for example, Ukrainian scholars, Russian scholars are very much needed right now to talk about what is happening in Ukraine and the attacks by Russia. And very similarly, those of us who have expertise talking about Asian American studies, talking about critical race theory, talking about race and racism with the general public have a role to play. And humanities centers and the field of humanities in general, be it history or literature or film, we are about telling stories. And so I'm not trying to privilege English or literature when I say that. I think that there are many ways to tell stories. We tell stories in our scholarship. We tell stories when we teach. We tell informal stories and we share informal stories at meal times with friends, with family, with colleagues. And I think that is something that the humanities does really well, gives us the tools to tell better stories. And as scholars in a university, we are able to tell the truth, right? And again, this is the role of the humanities and humanities centers, to tell the truth about history and society, because it doesn't benefit anyone if we are sugarcoating the truth, if we are hiding the things that are less savory about US history, about our fields of study. And I think, again, the role of humanities and humanities centers is to invest in scholarship that helps us tell the truth and to tell better stories. And so what I want to do, pivoting now, is to tell you my story, and to tell you my story as a way to help you understand what motivates me to embrace anti-racism, and to show you that I believe I'm not someone that early on in my academic career, and let's say, after I graduated from high school and went to college, would be someone who would be talking to you right now in the role that I'm talking to you. Because I am a first generation kid who grew up in a very working class, middle class family. So this is me. I don't know if you can see my cursor with the classic Chinese bowl haircut. This is very much a 1970s photograph. That's my cousin Greg. And that's my brother Chris, and this is my cousin Janine, and we're sitting in front of, I actually don't remember whose house it was, but one of our homes in the Bay Area of Hayward, California. And you can see Hayward right here in the East Bay in California, Northern California. So the reason I have two other maps on this slide, one of Jamaica and one of China, is that I am the daughter of an immigrant mother from Jamaica whose parents were themselves immigrants from Hong Kong. And I'm the daughter of an immigrant refugee father from China, whose grandparents were from, my grandmother was from Shanghai, my nanai, and my grandfather was from Chongqing. So right here, more central China. My mother likes to joke that I'm from peasant stock on her side of the family and aristocratic stock on my father's side, because my grandfather was an international, my yaya was an international banker who spoke 8 different languages. And when he found himself to be a refugee at the age of 52 in New York, Chinatown, couldn't really pick up the English language. I could communicate with him in really rudimentary English, but I needed to rely on my father to translate things that were beyond, I would say, a first or second grade level. And my grandfather was also a really proud man. So a typical immigrant story to the United States or anywhere else in the world is that people came from their home countries having enormous education, enormous wealth, found themselves without that wealth in a new country where they didn't know the language. And then they worked any kind of job that they could find, becoming a janitor, being a cook, driving a taxi cab. This is a very common narrative. This was sadly not my grandfather's narrative because he was a very proud man who couldn't bring himself to do menial labor when he was used to being a very rich, a very important man back in China. And so it was actually my grandmother, who was a Shanghai beauty, who had to go to work so that the family had something to live on once they had, fled communist China and arrived in the United States. My mother's story is similar and different. So my mother's story is that her father was the 4th youngest son, who was not going to inherit the meager family farm outside of Hong Kong, and found himself in Jamaica because at that time, Jamaica was part of the British Commonwealth. It was a colony of the UK, and as was Hong Kong. And so it was easy to travel from Hong Kong to Jamaica. When I say easy, it was allowable, I suppose you could say, through papers. Certainly it wasn't easy because you had to take, to get from my family's village in Hong Kong, you had to take some kind of transportation, probably a horse and cart in the 1920s, which is when my grandparents immigrated to Kowloon Harbor. You had to get on a boat that took weeks to get you over to the western part of Canada. You had to take a train overland. In my grandmother's case, because she was a Chinese woman, she was seen to be diseased and was kept in quarantine for 2 weeks in Vancouver, British Columbia, until they could clear her. And then after she took a train that took a week to arrive in Nova Scotia, she had to take another boat until she arrived in Kingston, Jamaica. So the many types of paths that my grandparents had to take in order to get to the point where my parents would meet and marry in New York City is really quite remarkable. And when I think about this, when I think especially about my grandmother, my popo, on my mother's side, who had an 8th grade education, the fact that I am talking to you as director of a Humanities Center at a university is still quite astounding to me. So because we were a working class family, we didn't own books. Books were seen as a luxury. I received books as gifts for Christmas or for my birthday. What we did do was we went to the public library, and this is the actual public library that my family would go to every week. So like Saturday morning, we would get in the car, we would go to the public library, we would return all the books we had gotten the week before, and I would check out the maximum number of books that I could check out. And this is a small sampling of the kind of books that I devoured as a child and an adolescent. And some of these titles are going to be very familiar to you. I really liked speculative fiction, science fiction. So I devoured the Lloyd Alexander series, the Susan Cooper series. I made my way through Judy Blume's oeuvre. And like everyone else who was an aspiring writer, I devoured Little Woman and imagined myself to be Jo March. I also went through all Jane Austen phase, and I found East of Eden. I was actually given East of Eden as a book, I should say, for Christmas. It was in a compendium that my parents gave me of Steinbeck's works. And so at the age of 11, I read East of Eden, and it was the first time that I encountered a Chinese American character. There is a Chinese American character called Lee in East of Eden. And it may be one of the reasons that East of Eden became my favorite book, because it wasn't until I was assigned the Woman Warrior my first year at UC Santa Barbara in 1989 that I actually read a work written by a Chinese American woman about Chinese Americans. So the closest I had come to was finding the character of Lee in East of Eden. And the closest images I had of Chinese Americans were seeing them in the Flower Drum Song, the musical by Oscar and Hammerstein, when it came on TV and syndication. So Santa Barbara, and taking my first Asian American literature class, or rather Asian American Studies class, which was literally called Introduction to Asian American Studies, Asian American 101, was the first time that I encountered Asian American literature. That class and reading Woman Warrior changed my life, because it made me realize that Asian American, and specifically Chinese American women, could and did write books. Previous to this, when I would go to my public library, I would trace my fingers along the spines of the books under HO. And I would go past the HOs, not that there was any. I'd never encountered anyone with my last name at the public library in the 1970s and 80s. And I would go to where HOPE would be, because I wanted to be a writer. Like at a young age, I knew I wanted to try and capture that feeling I had as a reader, immersing myself in these narrative worlds. And I thought in order to be a writer, I had to use a pen name that was anglicized, that was not my name, Jennifer Ho, but a name that I thought my 11-year-old self thought was sophisticated and cosmopolitan, and that was Jacqueline Hope. So I invented this whole persona, this future pen name persona called Jacqueline Hope, thinking that would be the name that I would write under one day, because I didn't have any models or knowledge that Asian American people or Chinese American women wrote books. And I certainly didn't think they wrote books like Woman Warrior. And so taking that class and encountering Asian American literature made me realize that people could write stories about being a Chinese American person growing up in California, about things that I had experienced. And it really completely upended my sense of what was possible. Because before, what I thought was possible was that I was going to have to write under a white sounding name about white experiences, because that is what I had previously consumed. Reading Woman Warrior and then taking other ethnic studies classes and Asian American literature classes introduced me to a whole other world of what was possible, about a different story of America than I had previously been exposed to. And that's what led me to pursue a PhD in English. And so I was probably the most naive graduate school to ever walk the face of this planet. I applied to PhD programs in locations that I thought I wanted to live, not based on what I thought were the best programs to get into. And trust me, I was advised. I had advisors at UC Santa Barbara who told me specifically where I should go. I ignored their advice. I found myself at Boston University because I wanted to live in Boston. Now, I think one could argue that it worked out because here I am. But I will say, if there's any aspiring undergraduates in the room, probably maybe trust your advisors more than I trusted mine. The other thing is that I decided to pursue a PhD rather than a master's degree because of funding, because most PhD programs are funded, whereas master's programs are underfunded. So I ended up getting a PhD at Boston University in the English department, in the English department. I will say it was an arduous process. Every semester I thought I might drop out. And one of the reasons I stayed was because I allowed myself to think that I might drop out, right? I'd complete a semester and then I'd think, okay, that's done. I'm not sure if I'm going to come back. And then somehow I found myself back. And in the course of actually doing research, I realized that there was something that I actually enjoyed about the hunt for books and following footnotes, footnote trails, which meant that I should end up being a geeky academic. And that's what I am. So that led me after graduation to doing a postdoctoral fellowship at UNC Chapel Hill. And you should always be careful what you say, right? Because I had actually said to my best friend at the time, got a job offer at UNC Chapel Hill. And she didn't end up taking it, but she was close to taking it. And I said to her, I can't come visit you in Chapel Hill. There are no Asians in the US South. Now, that's a very ignorant comment to make, obviously. But that's what I thought in my kind of ignorant impressions of the US South, right? That it was a place of virulent racism. It was a place in which Asians didn't occupy any role. And lo and behold, I found myself after graduation without any job prospects, but a postdoc at UNC Chapel Hill. That was a wonderful 2-year postdoc that led to a tenure track position. And in fact, that photo that you see of me here is a photo op that once I was hired in the tenure track, the admissions office immediately put me on their brochures. And this photo in particular was advertising the diversity of Chapel Hill. We could get into whole conversations about what that means. So I spent 17 years at UNC Chapel Hill, and I have to tell you, it was a great 17 years. I had the best education in race and racism that I could have asked for. I was forced to confront my own prejudices about what it meant to live in the US South and to really understand the role of the US South as part of the story of America that I was sharing, right? Because the story of America, if we're talking about the US South, is that the US South is a place that lost the Civil War, and that is backwards, and that is stuck, and that is bigoted. The US South is also a place of fierce anti-racism allies and advocates of all identities, and a space that is rich in culture and food and conviviality, and one that can be alienating at times, I will also say, now that I am outside the US South, but I think it has a complexity that people who don't spend time in the US South really don't appreciate. Now, you may be asking yourself, if I love the US South so much, which I do, and I met my current husband and his family lives in Raleigh, why did I leave? I left for leadership. So there was, I would say, a ceiling that I encountered when I was at UNC. And I'm just going to speak frankly. And I say this not to throw UNC Chapel Hill under the bus. I think if you've been following the news as far as faculty of color, I don't have to really throw UNC Chapel Hill under the bus. There are many problems institutionally about supporting faculty of color. I am one of a dozen faculty of color who have left over the last 12 years because there really wasn't a place for some of us to lead in the way that we wanted to lead. And so when a position came up to direct the Center for Humanities and the Arts at CU Boulder, I applied and very thankfully got the position. And I started here at CU Boulder in August of 2019. And then 6 months later, I found that I, like the rest of the world, were in the midst of a global pandemic. And I've been doing this job longer online than I have in person. I still have colleagues I've only seen on Zoom screens. At the same time that I became the director of the Center for Humanities and the Arts at CU Boulder, I assumed the presidency of the Association for Asian American Studies. And I've actually just stepped down as being president. Our annual meeting ended last week. And on Saturday at 7 o'clock, I officially stepped down from being president. I'm relieved, to be honest with you. It's been a lot to be president of the Association for Asian American Studies, during a global pandemic, because what we have seen with the rise of COVID-19 is a return of yellow peril. And if you're not familiar what I mean by yellow peril is a concept, it's an ideology that scapegoats people from Asia and associates them with both disease as well as with being a threat to US security, whether that's bodily security or national security. And so this mural that you're seeing in front of you is part of a campaign happening in New York City to address the virulent anti-Asian racism that was happening, because particularly in New York City, there have been very egregious attacks that have gone viral on videos showing Asian women in particular being attacked. Now, I want to say something about some of these videos, because the videos that have gone most viral show Asian women being attacked by Black men. And what that's caused is this false narrative that the majority of anti-Asian racism that happens is at the hands of Black men. What studies have shown, so there's a team of people, for example, at San Francisco State, as well as University of Michigan, who've been looking into the data, both in terms of the police reports and the headlines in newspapers and online. And when they started to look at the data, they showed that 74% of the attacks on Asian Americans were happening by white identified men. Some of it is happening by Black identified men, some by Latino men, some by women. The majority of the attacks happen by men, some by Asian American men, right? South Asian men, other non-Chinese men who see anyone who is believed to be Chinese as a threat. And this leads me towards the end of my talk, which is about anti-racism advocacy. So when I found myself to be in the twin leadership positions of being the president of the Association for Asian American Studies, as well as director of the Center for Humanities and the Arts, I found myself in a unique position to be able to have a voice that could intervene in conversations around anti-Asian racism, to try and set the record straight about the kind of images that people were seeing. And in particular, after the Atlanta spa shootings, in which 8 people were killed, 6 of whom were Asian women, that I could talk about what it means to be an Asian woman in America and have a platform like CNN to address these concerns about. And because I work in critical race theory, with all the attacks on critical race theory, I began to be interviewed mostly by Colorado news outlets to talk about what critical race theory is and what it's not. And that brings me to the end of my talk. So thank you for listening to me share my story, my intellectual genealogy. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I hope you've enjoyed seeing pictures of my dogs. And I'm happy to take questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Jennifer. I will give folks a little time to either raise their hands or post questions. There is a shout out from at least a couple of librarians I see here in attendance. So great to hear that library was a lifeline for you. So folks, please post your questions. And my first question to you is, Jennifer, is about the kind of work in public humanities you can share with us that you've done in your current position, and possibilities you see either at your current institution or projects you've worked on at UN Chapel Hill before you left. What are some of the possibilities for centers like ours to participate in this work? And concretely, what examples and advice can you give us as we attempt to do similar projects? Thank you. This is sort of a self-serving question that I couldn't really pass on.
Yeah. So because it's hard for me to do 2 things at once, I'm going to try and get to my website. And to share one of the things that I've done since taking over as director, right? So I do want to say, I think those of us, Christina, myself, any other Humanities Center directors who might be attending or seeing this, we're really stewards, right? We're stewards of the centers that we run. There are, unless we're the founding director, there are people who've come before us, there will be people who come after us. And so I think about this in particular in terms of wanting to create programs and opportunities that will last, right? That can possibly be continued and taken up even after that I've stepped down. And so one of the things that we've done at my center, and I'm going to put this in the chat, is to create a Jedi fellowship. So for those of you who may not be familiar, Jedi stands for justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. And the Jedi Fellowship is for graduate students. And because we're a public institution, I think, and you are as well, we have to be really careful. We can't have any fellowships that are specific by identity. And so the Jedi Fellowship is actually tied to our Jedi mission statement. And the Jedi mission statement was created by myself and my staff last summer. So here's our Jedi statement. And it basically is our declaration of the commitment of my center to the principles of justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. And I worked on it in collaboration with our staff, and then we shared it out. We at the Center for Humanities and the Arts, we have two boards, an internal and external board. So once the staff and I worked on the Jedi statement, I then shared it with our internal faculty board and our external community board. And the reason I did it that way is I wanted those of us who were doing the day-to-day work of the center to be the ones to create the statement, because we were going to be the ones who were going to be most living that out and messaging it out. But I did want to have buy-in from both the internal and the external board to say, this is the value that we are going to express publicly to the CU Boulder community or anyone coming to our website about what we think and what we want to promote. And it directly relates also to our mission statement. So when I took over as center director, there wasn't a mission statement. And the mission statement is something that I fine-tuned with both the internal and the external board, as well as the staff. And one of the things in our mission statement that was really important to, especially to the faculty steering committee, is that we mention that we, and I'm going to share also the website for our homepage. So our mission statement at the center says that the Center for Humanities and the Arts fosters community, supports collaboration, and inspires creativity and research while promoting equity, inclusion, and academic excellence. And that last part, equity, inclusion, and academic excellence, we agreed when we were doing the workshopping that that was a really important trio of values that we wanted to publicly signal out. And I think, so I do think that's something that for those of us who hold a modicum, right? I will say a modicum of power and prestige at our universities when we direct humanities centers, I think we can model for other units what it means to be doing equity work and to have that not just be a separate statement, but also be part of the actual mission of what we do.
That's great. Thank you for your answer, and thank you, Eric, for your question about skills. So this is Eric Johnson. He's one of our librarians at VCU. The question is, what skills do you think humanities faculty might best develop in order to better tell stories that need to be told? He says, I have a theory that libraries with multimedia centers and maker spaces and technical tools might offer a great partnership opportunity to help researchers learn to tell their stories.
So thank you for that question, Eric. If you know faculty, you know that we get really long-winded. Like I actually, partway through sharing my own public narrative, and I don't work off of a script, I just work off of PowerPoint slides, and I realized that I was getting really long. So there's a lot that I left out that I could have included. And so one of the things that I've tried to learn when, you know, embracing a more public humanities, public intellectual work is knowing when to stop. Right? What is the story that I want to tell, and how can I tell it in the most compelling and concise way possible? So any tools that you have as a librarian that can help people craft stories that are going to necessarily be incomplete as far as a scholar is concerned, right? So as far as a scholar is concerned, and I'm learning this because I'm trying to write for public audiences, which means not, you know, my temptation is always cite, always footnote, over explain, don't take credit. And when I'm, you know, writing a book proposal for a trade press, they're like, we don't like, you have to get rid of these footnotes, right? You can't do all these quotations. You have to, and so I think, helping scholars know their audiences and helping scholars develop better tools. Some people are not going to be comfortable being interviewed or doing a podcast or recording, but they can learn skills in terms of writing opinion pieces, or just even shorter, more first person. And first person point of view, I think, is also another tool that that a lot of scholars don't use, but is an effective public humanities tool to use to tell stories. That's, I think, something else that I think would be really great that librarians could help intervene.
Thank you for that thoughtful answer. Jess's question, which is the next up, prompts me to a comment I wanted to make after your introduction and your land acknowledgement, for which I was very grateful. And I used to do them in the past, but now we're in the process of finally, we hope, creating a land acknowledgement. We have a land acknowledgement group at the Humanities Research Center. Several people from that group are in attendance, and we have finally have the attention of the provost and the president, who will appoint a task force soon. So things are in motion, and we hope we can do this right, and not just in terms, as you said, of a performative text, but also sort of a long-term institutional commitment to what acknowledging, Indigenous history actually means. So this leads me to Jess's question. He's interested in hearing how, along land acknowledgement, you think about the history of land grant universities, which VCU is not, right? In Virginia Tech is the land grant, and our place in these institutions with settler legacies. Thank you, Jessie.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And actually something that I forgot to share when talking about land acknowledgements is that I think land acknowledgements need to be, in my opinion, taken up with also reparations. So the reparation work that CU Boulder and the Colorado University system in general is trying to do is minor, but at least it's some kind of step, right? So I don't want to get them off the hook entirely, but what they have done as a way to acknowledge, and we're not, and CU Boulder is not a land grant university either. I think the land grant university is actually Colorado State in Fort Collins, in Colorado. But nonetheless, right? I think CU Boulder, as well as the other three CU institutions, have a responsibility to talk about the land that we're occupying. And so what they're doing is that if you are a member of the Cheyenne, Arapaho, or Ute nations, no matter where you are in the world, you could be living in France, you could be living in Canada, you could be living in Colombia, you can receive in-state tuition. So it's not much, but it's something. There are those of us who would like members of the Cheyenne, Arapaho, and Ute nations to have free tuition. That's something that is on an ongoing point of negotiation with the CU system. My Humanities Center doesn't have a land acknowledgement on our website yet. I'm working with the Center for Native American and Indigenous Studies to think through what form of reparation the CHA can do. One of the things we're thinking about is offering a free summer, not a free, but to set aside one summer fellowship for a graduate student who is a member of one of these three tribes, or because there's probably too few graduate students who are a member of one of those three tribes, opening it up to Native American graduate students. The Native American part is tricky in terms of tribal identification, and whether that should be strictly contained to Native Americans with tribal identification versus Indigenous students. I've also been thinking about other kind of fellowships at the faculty level. We have a faculty fellow program, and we're thinking about setting aside a faculty fellowship for a Native American person. This again gets a little bit tricky though, because we're a state institution and we are technically not allowed to do such things. So that's the other tricky part, is trying to figure out how to do reparations and not find myself on doing something that I'm going to be told is illegal.
That's a very good point. And these are all very good ideas if they materialize. I mean, if the structure of the university allows for that, then these are ideas that our own land acknowledgement group has been discussing as we think about reparations or forms of not just honoring Indigenous history, but actually creating an institutional structure that promotes, the teaching of that history, engagement with communities, and so on. So thank you for that context. I know our colleague Christian has a question, but I'm trying to see whether this is the question she'd like me to ask or not. So I'll go on to Michael Hall's question, which is also a great one. What do you think about the role of creative artists in this work, in the work of storytelling? And I imagine how it connects to the mission of a humanities center. Thank you, Michael.
Yeah, no, thank you for that question. I think sometimes in humanity, certainly in humanities centers, when the word art isn't included, it can feel like that's secondary. And I know that when I came into my role as director, one of the things I did was a listening and learning tour. And I specifically made sure that I could meet with departments that had artists. Because what I knew from my interview, based on the kind of questions I got, and also based on just, people giving me a heads up, a lot of makers, a lot of artists had felt excluded from the work of the CHA at CU Boulder. And so one of the things that I made a commitment to was to make sure that on our faculty steering committee, that there's always at least 2, if not more, scholars, artists, faculty who identify as artists and who come from more traditional art departments, one could say, right? Whether that's film, whether that's art studio, art history and art studio, whether that's poetry, creative writing, or critical media practices, which is kind of one of these hybrid departments that we have here at CU Boulder. So artists have a key role to play in how we tell stories, because how we tell stories isn't just about the written word. We tell stories in so many different formats. And there are many wonderful multimedia collaborations. And so I don't know if anyone's familiar with the poet Paisley Rectal. I should really try and find her link. She has this amazing digital humanities multimedia project called The West, a Translation. I think I'm getting that right. She was the poet laureate of Utah. She teaches at University of Utah in Salt Lake City. It is an amazing work of art, work of poetry, work of translation, work of scholarship, work of visual media. I am not doing it justice, but it is like, I saw it and it blew my mind. And I just was raving about it for a week. I was like on social media saying, everyone stop what you're doing and look at this work by Paisley Rectal. That to me is like the best of what a humanities center should be promoting. These really innovative, creative ways to tell stories, to use multiple forms of media, to be public about it, to get people excited about the role of art and humanities and technology interacting together that can be used out of pure enjoyment or for scholarship or for teaching. I mean, and I think that's where I see, again, the work of the Humanities Center to be able to, I'm going to try and bring her out next year to be in conversation with a few of our scholars. And so that's, I think, again, a really exciting thing that artists in particular can do is to help me, right, as a humanities scholar who is not an artist, right, kind of think through the myriad possibilities of what storytelling is and how robust and creative and innovative artistic practices can be in telling stories. So ask me a long question because I'm going to try and find her website to share.
Sure. Thank you so much for that thoughtful answer. And I think we have time for just one more question. And I think that Michael Dickinson's question is perfect to end on this note. His question, well, first of all, he also thanks you for a thoughtful talk, and he brings up you know, the demonization of critical race theory. And, you know, we were very fortunate to still and are still, you know, teaching critical race theory and racial literacy courses. Our colleague Mignon Guy, actually, who shepherded that project, was here or may still be here. So our colleagues have been very active during the pandemic in this work of anti-racism. And yet, you know, we have a new governor who talks a little bit differently about CRT than we are used to. And so Michael's question is about you know, the demonization, why CRT has become such a hot button in the headlines, seemingly overnight. I don't know if I would necessarily agree with that, Michael, but we can discuss afterwards. But really, in some places, perhaps more so than others.
No, thank you very much for that question. I think it seems like it's overnight, right? I get that. Like it has been brewing for over a year, but it does feel like overnight, all of a sudden, people have begun to panic over critical race theory. So in the chat, I included a link to an article that I was invited to write by the Colorado Times reporter on the moral panic over critical race theory. What's really interesting about critical race theory now, right? And when I say critical race theory, maybe I should abbreviate to CRT. So what's interesting about CRT, which is to be distinguished from the field of critical race theory, is that we can actually date the moral panic, because Christopher Rufo, who is a political operative, he's a GOP political operative, got interviewed in the New Yorker, and he gave us a timeline. He gave us a really specific timeline because he wants credit. It's really interesting, right? It's great that he has an ego and he wants credit because it allows us to see that there's a clear timeline. And the timeline is this. He was doing some research in the archives in Seattle and came across some references to Marx, came across an obscure kind of legal article that referenced critical race theory. And then he went to the critical race theory article itself. And then he started to look at the footnotes. And he noticed that in the footnotes, someone had referenced Marx by way of Louis Althusser, right, a French philosopher. So, you know, it's 3 degrees of separation. But once you get to Marx, you've got socialism and communism, right? That's all he needed. All he needed was to say, here's a field of study based on Marxism, which is based on socialism and communism. And then you've got your new Red Scare. So then he goes on to Fox News and he gets interviewed by Tucker Carlson. And he is sharing how there is this field called critical race theory that is infiltrating all sectors of kind of public life. And he particularly points out to a diversity training that, from what I've read about, was problematic, right? So let me just say this, not all diversity trainings are equal. This diversity training is problematic. And by the way, I kind of hate the word diversity, which is actually one of the reasons that it doesn't show up in my mission statement, because I feel like the word diversity has become devoid of real value. And we use it to apply to so many things. And again, as a scholar, I think it's important to be accurate. If we're talking about intervening in racism, we should talk about what anti-racism practices are we going to engage in. If we want to talk about overlapping oppression, we should talk about intersectionality. So Rufo then gets a call from Mark Meadows. And this is August of 2020. And Mark Meadows is like, hey, tell me more about this critical race theory. And then in September, there's a memo, there's an executive order from the Trump administration banning critical race theory from the federal government. And in places like Iowa, who became so worried that their federal dollars were going to be impacted, they started to cancel all sorts of diversity training and eliminating the phrase critical race theory. So Biden wins, right, in November. Then you have the January 6th insurrection. And at the same time in 2021, you have a new front that's happening with critical race theory, which is Koch brother money intervening in school boards and in state legislation. So which is why you start seeing in the whole of 2021, all of a sudden you have various school boards being afraid that critical race theory has infiltrated K through 12 schools and that they are making children feel bad. And very specifically, white parents are worried that white children are being made to feel bad about slavery. And that's really the specific example that people are using. It's really incredible just how powerful and nefarious Christopher Rufo is, and I got to give him credit. It's brilliant, right? It's brilliant to use an obscure legal field of study, critical race theory, that no one knew anything about. And that's the thing. It's got three words that people are scared of: critical, race, and theory. Nobody who's attacking critical race theory has ever read any critical race theory, right? The example I like to use is that, yes, in seventh graders are probably learning about electricity, but their teachers are not teaching them electrical engineering. That's the equivalent of saying critical race theory is being taught in K through 12 schools, right? I hope people are talking about the transatlantic slave trade. I hope they're talking about settler colonialism. I actually doubt that that's happening in the majority of cases, especially now, because there is so much fear, depending on the school district you're in. And I know in your state, your new governor basically ran on an anti-CRT platform, which, I mean, if I were at VCU and teaching, I regularly teach critical race theory, would I be able to teach? I don't know.
I do too. And I was concerned, but my understanding is that it doesn't really affect higher education. The policies and the restrictions are primarily for K through 12. So I guess at this point, we still have a shot, but I don't know, maybe I misspoke. But I will continue. I just taught CRT, a unit on CRT last week in my Introduction to Theory course. So you've heard it here. You've heard it here. This has been delightful. And I can't wait to see you in person. And maybe at some point we have an opportunity to bring you to campus so you can, taste some grits. I know we were talking about this.
Oh, I miss grits. Yeah.
It's pretty good enrichment. Well, so thank you very much to Professor Jennifer Ho and to all of you in the audience. For those of you who couldn't make it, if you're watching this, you'll know that recordings are available after the events. And I also wanted to plug our final event of the semester at the HRC. Jennifer's talk tonight concludes our speaker series, our signature speaker series, and the event on Monday will conclude our Meet VCU Authors series. So I'd like to invite you to join us on Monday, April the 25th at 4 p.m., more specifically to join my colleague Ryan Smith, who will be in conversation with David Weinfeld about his recent book, An American Friendship, Horace Callan, Alan Locke, and the Development of Cultural Pluralism, that just came out from Cornell University Press. And I look forward to welcoming you next year, maybe in person and Zoom, for an exciting new slate of events that Jesse Goldstein and I are planning right now, and Ronnie as well, with the Faculty Advisory Board on the broad umbrella of environmental humanities. So stay tuned for announcements forthcoming in the summer. And just thank you so much for spending this time with us today and for supporting the HRC. Have a good night, everyone, and see you soon.